unveiled, titled A Generation Revolts from the 1970s Student Movement to the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. Before that, he had a master's degree from the London School of Economics. And I studied in England, and I know what a prestigious university that is. Only very bright people get to study there. So that tells you something. And before that, he got a dual BA in political science and comparative area studies from Duke University, which is also an outstanding university. So we were able to hire this brilliant person to come to join our university here. His research interests include Islamic social movements, Islamic law and society, U.S. policy towards Middle East, and Islam in America, and he's currently researching, doing research with the help of a Humanities Center faculty fellowship. He recently won one of that, and he is doing research on that topic. His first book will be published by Oxford University Press, and as you know, that's an outstanding press, next spring, and it will be entitled Answering the Call, Popular Islamic Activism in Egypt, 1970 through 1981. So I am delighted to welcome to the podium, and you should welcome him too, Professor Abdullah Al-Arian, who will speak to us on A Generation Revolts from the 1970s student movement to the 2011 Egyptian revolt. Please welcome him with applause.
Thank you very much to Walter and to everyone at the Humanities Center for putting on this event. I think the attendance here really is a testament to the importance that this topic, or at least this, let's say, decades-long interest in Egypt and in the events in the Middle East, has among people in the United States, especially given a lot of the enthusiasm generated by a lot of the recent events that have gone on in the region, the prospects for a popular uprising and a transition toward democratic rule. So I thought I'd begin by setting the stage for my project, kind of more broadly. My presentation today is adapted from the epilogue to the book of my book, which chronicles the return of Islamic activism to the fore of Egyptian society throughout the decade of the 1970s. I chart this development through two distinct phenomena. First, the reconstitution of the Muslim Brotherhood by veteran leaders of the organization who languished for nearly 2 decades in the prisons of Gamal Abdel Nasser, only to be released by Anwar Sadat in the early 1970s. And then the new generation of student activists from this period as well, who grew up in Nasser's Egypt, but had no conception of Islamic activism, but came to adopt that path, and in fact formed the basis, the sort of grassroots basis of the reconstituted Muslim Brotherhood organization by the late 1970s. And so it's this latter group that I'm particularly interested in here, and this informs the basis of my talk here today. So the epilogue essentially builds on the original study by moving the conversation forward into the future and seeing where the various figures from this period have landed in today's Egypt, and in the years since their days as student activists. And so one way that I thought is kind of helpful to think about this is to kind of compare it a little bit to the timeless comedy classic film Animal House, whose final scene features a snapshot of the main characters with captions that basically tell us where they find themselves years into the future, years after the events of the film itself. So if the book is kind of like the Muslim Brotherhood version of Animal House, today's talk is basically like those snapshots that we find in the final scene. And to hammer the point home, I thought I'd actually bring a few of those snapshots here with me today. So we have first Abdul Moneim Abul Futuh, who was one of the student union leaders in the 1970s, who eventually left the Muslim Brotherhood and after an unsuccessful presidential run has founded his own political party, A Stronger Egypt. And here we see him actually in a very famous confrontation that he had with the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, in the late 70s, actually on live television. It was one of the more embarrassing moments for the president, who had to kind of shout him down among the many student activist leaders. Here we have Abdullah Al-Arian, another student activist from the 70s who was elected the youngest member of parliament and eventually became the second in command of the Muslim Brotherhood's current Freedom and Justice Party, the party that's currently was elected both to the presidency and also had the majority of seats elected into parliament. Third, we have Khairat al-Shatir, who made millions as a businessman and climbed to the ranks to become one of the most powerful Muslim Brotherhood leaders and political strategists. Today, he kind of is seen as the sort of orchestrator of a lot of the strategy coming out of the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, he has a very strong background in business and of course brings that kind of influence into his role within the organization. And finally, my favorite one, Mohamed Morsi, who goes on to become the president of Egypt. And so of course we see that initially at least he didn't necessarily have a very strong leadership position, but it's only because of his role as a kind of a good soldier, so to speak, and we'll talk a little bit about the different dynamics internally within the organization and how it is that someone like Morsi could actually rise through the ranks to become the nominee for the presidency. But before delving into the intricacies of this generation's development, I'd like to set the stage by discussing some of the broad themes that are raised in an important recent work of fiction. In her 2008 novel, Farag, which means release, Radwa Ashur tells the story of a generation disillusioned by the broken promises of an unfulfilled revolution. Even after experiencing the estrangement and dislocation caused by her father's political activism and subsequent imprisonment by the Nasser regime, the novel's narrator, Neda, finds herself drawn to the student movement of the early 1970s. The amorphous and non-ideological activism of this generation's youth contrasts with that of the previous one and appears to cast their struggle as much against the failures of their parents as it did against the early excesses of Sadat's rule. Before long, Neda too finds herself imprisoned, along with hundreds of her university comrades. Unable to cope with the monumental struggle facing them upon their release from prison, many of Neda's colleagues give in to despair, abandoning a cause which they characterize as a historical call for the transformation of society toward brotherhood, equality, justice, and happiness. Instead, the characters engage in a prolonged period of self-criticism, internalizing the defeat of their aborted dream, and experiencing such alienation through the subsequent years that one character dubs her generation the stillborn. The novel's events are based in large part on actual events, including the rise to prominence and abrupt fall of Arwa Saleh and Siham Sabri, leaders of the student movement who may have spent only a short time in Sadat's prisons, but exhibited a perpetual yearning for true liberation, finding it only upon taking their own lives in 1997 and 2003, respectively. To disentangle the complex social and political realities that would cause two bright and accomplished women to commit such an act in a cultural context in which suicide is seldom visible and rarely discussed, Ashur invokes Foucault's concept of the disciplinary society. The structures and instruments of power, as they existed in the authoritarian environment of post-Nasserist Egypt, meant that not only would the state exercise complete control over the physical bodies of those it segregated from the rest of society through its use of political incarceration, it also ensured that even upon their return to society, dissidents faced a parallel set of constraints on their behavior, which Foucault likens to the panopticon, a disciplinary mechanism that employs a subtle coercive technique, primarily surveillance, that assures the automatic functioning of power. By the time Sadat ordered the roundup of all political dissidents in September of 1981, the process of subverting popular activism to the whims of the state had become complete. Only two forces proved capable of challenging this arrangement. The first was the militant underground groups who relied on secrecy and violence in their contention against the state. And the second was the Muslim Brotherhood, with a disciplined and rigid internal hierarchical structure that permitted it to pursue its far-reaching social activist mission. But 30 years later, only the latter demonstrated durability in the face of continuing state repression. When popular protests erupted across Egypt on January 25, 2011, the Muslim Brotherhood was poised to place its decades of experience in the service of a national movement to overthrow the regime of Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak. The movement that occupied Tahrir Square and the other major public spaces in urban centers around the country for 18 days was led by students and young professionals and was devoid of any particular ideological orientation. Like the movement that dominated Egyptian campuses in the 1960s and 70s, these youth demonstrated strength through unity and courage, espousing universal convictions such as freedom, social justice, and equality of opportunity for all. In short, They demanded a brighter future than the one their parents faced a generation earlier. Unlike the prior era, however, this period exhibited several critical features that would help determine the outcome of the popular revolt. From the technological advancements that facilitated wider mobilization, to the shifts in domestic and international political and economic conditions, and the evolution of modes of contention. The January 25th movement held an advantage over prior protests. But one can also add to these the decades of experience brought to the movement by an entire generation of activists who grew up with the regime and internalized its repressive tactics. Ultimately, as much as the toppling of Mubarak symbolized the coming of age of a cosmopolitan, tech-savvy generation, it also saw the fruition of a seemingly static dream long held by an older cadre of Egyptians. And here I'd like to single out one of the central arguments that I aim to make here. For when the regime began grooming Gamal Mubarak to succeed his aging father over a decade earlier, the country's political order betrayed a more deeply entrenched authoritarianism, as the younger Mubarak, an investment banker by trade, began to assume control of a greater share of Egypt's political and economic institutions, along with a rising oligarch class. A panic set in among the country's activists, resulting in the establishment of the Kifaya movement, which means enough, to oppose the regime's plans for hereditary rule. The unspoken tenor of the emerging national struggle suggested a visceral rejection of the notion that an octogenarian president would hand over the country to a son and his friends in their early 40s, effectively bypassing an entire generation, or perhaps, to kind of put it more succinctly, dictatorship quite literally skips a generation. The passionate response with which this project was met served as a testament to the notion that society could scarcely withstand an assault on the natural order of things, that is, barring a wide swath of the population from public service and the right to contribute to the growth and development of their nation. It is within this context, then, that the political developments in the months after the January 25th uprising should be understood. Barely a year after Mubarak's overthrow, 5 of the leading candidates to succeed him in Egypt's first democratic presidential election in history came out of the 1970s generation of student leaders and activists. The rise to the fore of Egypt's post-revolutionary political scene was no mere accident. Rather, it was the product of a process that had been at work for several decades after the rise of the student movement and the concurrent reappearance of the Muslim Brotherhood as an organized force in Egyptian society. It's worthwhile to examine the major social and political developments over the course of the 30-year period since Mubarak's ascent, placing particular emphasis on the figures who would later assume a dominant role in the post-revolutionary political transition. And here we have some of the names that we've already seen so far. Khairat al-Shatir, who was initially a member, or initially a nominee by the Muslim Brotherhood, the kind of first choice, but was disqualified early on in the process. Mohamed Morsi, of course, who does go on to become the nominee of the Muslim Brotherhood and actually ends up winning the election quite narrowly. Hazem Salah Abu Ismail, who's considered part of the Salafi trend, although of course he's still to some extent affiliated with the sort of Muslim Brotherhood school of thought more broadly. Abdul Moneim Abul Futuh, who was a long-term member of the Muslim Brotherhood, but actually ends up leaving to nominate himself as a candidate for the presidency independently of the organization, which of course proceeds to disavow him and actually compete quite fiercely against his own candidacy. And finally, Hamdin Sabahi, who's not part of the Islamic movement, but is still a product of the 1970s student movement and was part of the, perhaps more the leftist wing of that movement, and also runs as a candidate for the presidency during the last election. So there are 2 major developments that I'd like to focus on that I think are at the heart of the ways that we find the Muslim Brotherhood as it exists in its current form today. And these exist both in tension with one another and also kind of complement one another. The first is what has been called the tanzim, or this emphasis or focus on the internal organizational development of the Muslim Brotherhood's organization, which prioritizes strict discipline, it develops a strong structural hierarchy, it prioritizes secrecy, and security measures against repressive regime tactics. It's a very inward-focused and very structural look at the organization, whereas the second approach looks more at external outreach. It focuses on the movement's social activist mission, continued engagement in social and state institutions like mosques, charitable associations, student unions, professional syndicates, parliament, and even develops a political platform and strategy, and ultimately actually culminates in the idea to run within elections, parliamentary elections, and of course eventually into the presidential race. And so both of these impulses existed in tension with one another because each one, of course, has different priorities. And to some extent, one could potentially compromise the other. So the extreme sort of emphasis on inward-looking organizational structure will certainly affect the ability of the organization to kind of focus on outreach and kind of building bridges within civil society, and also with its engagement with the regime, because it takes a very cautious and distrustful approach to its relationship with the regime that focuses primarily through the lens of the security dilemma posed by a repressive authoritarian government. The second approach, of course, is far more favorable in the sense that it's more accommodationist. It's really trying to find some way to actually engage with the regime, to try to build perhaps small victories into something that will gain the Muslim Brotherhood some type of official recognition in the long term. And this was always kind of a constant struggle. The organization was officially banned under Abdel Nasser. It applies to be readmitted as a lawful recognized organization under Sadat. That case has actually languished in the courts for over 40 years, so it's never officially been decided. And so it kind of has always operated in this sort of semi-legal status in which it's technically outlawed, and when it's convenient for the regime to arrest individuals and place them in prison, it charges them with being members of an outlawed organization. And yet they function quite openly all the time without ever being arrested on that basis either. So there's this kind of tension in terms of the political use of the lack of recognition. And that's something, of course, that the organization has hoped to achieve by virtue of its engagement with state institutions in particular. So part of the way that this tension was reconciled very early on was through the figure of the general guide who comes out of the 1970s period, a man by the name of Omar al-Misani. The general guide position, of course, is the chief leading kind of both spiritual but also kind of technical leader of the organization. He assumes this in the mid-70s once the organization is reconstituted, and he maintains that position until his death in 1986. And so he oversees a very critical decade in terms of what orientation will the Muslim Brotherhood take. Will it go back in terms of its withdrawal from society that it experienced under the Nasser regime, or will it begin a sort of process of re-engagement? And this is essentially what he attempts to promote, while also understanding the concerns raised by the elder generation of more security-conscious people, people who are quite rightly, of course, concerned about the idea that the organization could once again be crushed. And so they're trying to learn and apply the lessons of the Nasser experience, in terms of their positions going forward. And so he tries to bridge this divide by basically saying, we now have a new generation of youth activists, all of whom grew up going into the university system as student activists, and now they want to be more engaged with society. They ran in the student union elections. They were quite successful. By the late 70s, virtually every university in Egypt had an Islamist leadership at the student union level. And then once we start to get into the 1980s, and most of that generation is now graduating and going on into their professions of choice, we start to see a desire to go into student union elections as well, or rather professional unions as well, in addition to the student unions, professional syndicates, whether it's the medical doctors, the engineers, syndicates for people within the scientific community as well. And so rather than sort of hinder that impulse, Miseni encourages the youth to kind of go out and engage within society and to try to spread the Muslim Brotherhood's mission broadly, while at the same time other members of the organization are developing into what has been called the kind of conservative camp. I think of it more as a conservative pragmatist camp, because I think it's important to note that this is not a divide that's happening along ideological lines, right? The Muslim Brotherhood has a generally accepted ideology within all of the members of its organization. There are not too many differences, and in fact this was part of the strategy, is to not open up difficult questions like, for instance, the application of Sharia law, which is some of the questions that are now being discussed, that there's this general assumption of what it stands for and what it doesn't necessarily stand for. And so these differences, rather than being ideological, are probably far more strategic in nature. The idea is how to actually apply and try to carry out the mission of the organization. And of course, you have one camp that feels that a strong internal structure that insulates itself from the possibility of intense regime repression on the order of what happened under Nasser, or even in the late Sadat period, was the way to go. To protect the organization against outside forces. There's also a severe distrust of society in general. The society, of course, which under the Nasser era had abandoned the Muslim Brotherhood and allowed them to kind of languish in the prisons for that long. And the other approach, of course, which is that more engagement will more deeply entrench the organization so far within society, kind of extending its tentacles, that it would be actually more difficult for the regime to then repress them at that point. And so those you might call more the reformers, or the people who are kind of looking more at the way that if they can influence the leadership of the organization to try to take on this approach, would ultimately generate far better outcome. And so looking beyond just even these institutions, the ultimate measure, I think, really comes from examining the record of the Muslim Brotherhood in parliamentary elections. This was the kind of final stage of regime engagement. This was the final stage of trying to actually find some sort of accommodation with the state. And this happens, of course, quite periodically over a period of many years. But beginning in 1984, under Musani's leadership, the Muslim Brotherhood decides we will begin to actually run some of our members as independents for parliamentary elections and trying to actually have a voice within the broader decision-making of the parliament, although the parliament's role is quite, frankly, more of a rubber stamp against what the regime is doing. But there was a mutual need here on the part of both the Mubarak regime very early on, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood during this phase. So from the perspective of the regime, to actually admit more independent voices or social voices within the parliament was actually a means through which Mubarak himself could actually acquire his own legitimacy. That he hoped, having come in as just a new president, that he wanted to make certain overtures. So this is why initially he actually revised the law governing professional syndicates to actually allow the entry of the Muslim Brotherhood into those elections. And then more gradually he even revised the elections law for the parliament, so that although they couldn't run as an actual political party because religious organizations were not allowed to have any political presence, they could at least run as independents in tandem with pre-existing parties. And so in the first, there was a kind of unusual or unlikely coalition with the New Weft party. The Weft, of course, being a sort of liberal, secular political party that has roots kind of dating all the way back to the early liberal era in Egypt in the 20th century, early 20th century. And yet the Muslim Brotherhood found some common ground to actually run some of their candidates. And so when this coalition won 58 seats in 1984, the Muslim Brotherhood actually got 8 of those seats allocated to them. They continued this process of trying to reach out to other parties. And so by 1987, the Muslim Brotherhood ran as part of another coalition with the Labour Party this time, and in addition to other parties. And this time it received 36 seats. So this was kind of a huge jump for them within just the span of a few years. But by the time we get to the early 1990s, we find that the regime is actually starting to recognize the potential threat raised by a Muslim Brotherhood organization that is far more deeply entrenched in society. And so they actually revised the electoral laws in order to actually circumvent the ability of the Muslim Brotherhood and other independent voices to actually be elected into the parliament. And so as protest to this revision of the law, along with many other grievances that the organization had with the growing authoritarianism of the Mubarak regime, the Muslim Brotherhood actually decides to boycott the law. But this is an interesting moment for the organization because we actually start to see some of the divisions that are appearing internally within the group. On the one hand, like we said, we have this accommodationist, sort of outreach-oriented faction within the Muslim Brotherhood that's actually quite upset with the decision by the leadership to boycott the elections. They thought that they were still making considerable gains. They wanted to continue to run as independents, trying to find some way that they could not actually boycott the elections, even if it would have meant a defeat or a downsize in the number of seats that they received. And so they ultimately are upset about this, but again, continue to sort of try to work from within the organization and try to find some ways of actually reforming it internally. On the other hand, of course, you have the more security-conscious voices who by this point had actually, again, because of their attention to the structural hierarchy of the organization, had more or less come to command all of the leadership positions within the Muslim Brotherhood. Everyone from the General Guide to what's called the Guidance Bureau, which is the kind of key core decision-making body within the Muslim Brotherhood. The Guidance Bureau is the one, it has elected members from the broader sort of assembly, popularly elected assembly within the Muslim Brotherhood. But these elections generally happen in a very political way, and they generally tend to elevate people who are part of this core group of people who are good at taking orders, very disciplined, very believe in kind of the strict hierarchy of the organization. And so this develops a much more insular leadership for the Muslim Brotherhood going forward. And this, of course, comes into play 20 years later once we get into the decision of whether or not to engage in the 2011 revolt, and then, of course, all the decisions that have come about since then. By 1995, the situation between the regime and the Muslim Brotherhood reaches a sort of boiling point. We start to see that the regime is actually clamping down. In the early 90s, they've actually created criminal cases that are tried in military tribunals that end up arresting most of the leadership of the organization. And this has a dual effect, that the Muslim Brotherhood, on the one hand, is faced with this dilemma as the regime begins to crack down on it, to kind of discredit the people who are actually promoting the idea of accommodation or promoting the outreach model. These reformists become discredited by the idea that the regime is actually arresting people. And so people who actually are the more conservatives within the organization point to the crackdown that happens in the early 90s, and they say, see, this is exactly what we were warning against. But of course, it's those members who are ultimately being arrested, which also has the dual effect of weakening the organization internally. By taking many of their leaders and placing them in prison, it's supposed to kind of weaken the structural hierarchy of the organization. So there's a sort of dual-pronged effect that happens as a result of the regime's repression in the 1990s, and there's a kind of reset that happens in terms of where the group is going to find itself going forward. So by the time we get to the 95 elections, the Muslim Brotherhood decides to go all in. They run 170 candidates, none of whom are victorious. One of them is, but he's later disqualified, and so they end up with no representation in the parliament. And this, of course, leads to additional criminal cases against many of the people who kind of dared to run in those elections. By the time we get into the year 2000, there's again a little bit of a thaw in that relationship, and this was kind of something that Mubarak had become sort of expert on, is to allow things to reach a certain boiling point, only to then, sort of, allow for a little bit of breathing space for the organization, and so they are able to kind of run some candidates in the 2000 election. They won 17 seats, and a lot of these happen to coincide with moments in which Mubarak's own legitimacy seems to be at stake. And so again, by this point, he's running for his 5th term, perhaps. I mean, assuming that these elections have any sort of meaning, but for Mubarak's regime, certainly the idea of trying to continue to run in these elections it establishes his legitimacy, even when he's going for his 5th and 6th terms in office. And so internally within the organization at this stage, we find, again, a division among members of this generation. So on the one hand, you have people like Mohamed Morsi and Khairat al-Shatir, who are now becoming more deeply entrenched within the core of the organization. They're becoming, again, the sort of loyal soldiers, but also getting to the point where they're becoming decision makers as well. So by this point, Khairat al-Shatir is no longer kind of just an outgrowth of this earlier generation, but is actually becoming a key player himself. And based on his sort of allegiances and his loyalties, he's actually developing a certain resentment of the other members, people like Abdul Moneim Abul Futuh and others who are kind of far more outwardly focused, more independent thinkers, far less likely to kind of fall in line with the typical kind of party line. And so those kind of cleavages begin to emerge, especially after 2000, and they play out in a lot of the internal elections within the Muslim Brotherhood's leadership hierarchy. And so again, when there's discussion of who to admit to this guidance bureau, they want to have the sort of token representation of people who are more politically engaged. And so Abul Futuh actually is one of those people who kind of has a seat at the table, so to speak, but is constantly being overruled, disregarded, and so finds his frustrations building. And this actually carries over into another group of individuals within the Muslim Brotherhood, so that by the mid-90s, actually, we find the first sort of major exodus of the organization, led by a few members like Abdullah Al-Arian, who we see here at the top, who actually decide that they want to go full force into politics and don't want any part of this kind of rigid organizational hierarchy that the Muslim Brotherhood represents. And so this, in many ways, I think, is a preview of things to come, things that actually really sort of appear after the 2011 uprising. But this is kind of the first sign that there are internal breaks of people who just want to develop a political party. And so these members at least found what's called a Wasat party, which just means the center party. They want a very moderate, liberalized kind of Islamist platform. They immediately petition the government to have approval for their political party, and they're turned down. But they continue to operate as a sort of unrecognized political party for the next 10 or 15 years or so. By the time we get into, the uprising, they now feel that they're poised to actually play a role in what's happening. But because of their lack of an organizational structure, they're never really able to kind of gain the mass following that the Muslim Brotherhood has. They don't have the same kind of recruitment mechanisms. They don't have the same networks. And so again, there's a sense that there is something to the idea of having that strong, disciplined, internal structural hierarchy. And we kind of continue to see that theme play out again and again. And so by 2005, we find that the elections that were a product in some ways of the broader kind of democratization theme that the Bush administration was putting out for the Arab world. Mubarak felt like he was under pressure. There were the tensions that were going on within the region generally, that the Mubarak regime kind of made a calculation that they will allow greater involvement of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in fact, more recently, it's been uncovered that this was actually part of a agreement, a secret kind of agreement that was made between the central leadership that they would be given a certain amount of seats, and in exchange they would kind of back off from their opposition to the sort of inheritance project that the regime was putting on, so that they would basically be witnesses to Gamal Mubarak's rise into power to succeed his father. And so they win a whopping 88 seats, which makes up 1/5 of parliament. They run all as independents, but it's understood that this is the new Muslim Brotherhood contingent within the parliament. And of course, this is the last parliament, really, that the Muslim Brotherhood plays any role in before the uprising, because by the time we get into 2010, Mubarak kind of changes his mind and decides, in fact, they were more trouble than they were worth to have them kind of represented there. And of course, he ends up revising the electoral laws once again, and in the 2010 elections, they end up with 0 seats, down from the highest they'd ever known in terms of 88. And so the fluctuation we see again is a product of both the external pressures coming out from the regime, but also as part of the internal conversation that's taking place within the organization, many of whom were frustrated by the fact that their victory in 2005 never really amounted to any practical or substantive changes. And so there was a kind of push by certain elements within the organization to try to remove themselves from contention and to actually boycott the regime, to make a kind of bolder statement, and to stand with the broader political forces within Egyptian civil society, all of whom at this point had completely decided to boycott any dealings with the regime, and decided that they wanted to kind of institute real opposition and change and hold out for genuine reform. The primary goal of which was basically to end the hereditary republic that was underway in Egypt, as it had been in Syria and in Yemen and in other countries. And so by the time we get into the protest movement of January 25th, 2011, and here there's just a kind of tongue-in-cheek jab at the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood, in fact, doesn't partake in the protests when they first erupt on the 25th, but in fact only make that decision 3 days later. And this is a very telling moment for the organization, because as the Egyptian youth are kind of reaching a boiling point, deciding that they don't want to kind of stand idly by while the regime continues its abuses and continues the hereditary project, the Muslim Brotherhood internally is quite divided. On the one hand, you have this new generation of youth, all of whom find more commonality with other youth of their generation who may not be members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So their identities are now kind of shifting toward a broader, cosmopolitan nationalist identity that transcends perhaps their affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood. And this, of course, should pose a sort of threat for the future of the organization if it can't hang on to its core youth membership. And on the other hand, you have this other generation, this 1970s generation, many of whom are more oriented toward this kind of outreach, reformist mindset, and they also want to take part in the protest. And so the leadership of the organization decides, well, we can't officially bar anyone. We won't partake as an organization, but individual members are kind of free to do what they choose. And so they ultimately allow people like Abdul Moneim Abul Futuh and Esam al-Arian and a few others who actually take part in the protests on the 25th. And so the Muslim Brotherhood does have some representation on the ground at the very onset of the protests. But at the same time, as an organization, they only come down in full force 3 days later, the first kind of Friday of rage that happens on the 28th of January. And this, of course, has always been kind of held against the Muslim Brotherhood, the fact that they simply didn't go all in when the rest of the country was kind of all ready, that they actually had to sort of play catch-up. And part of the configuration that happens here is that it's actually this pragmatist, conservative element within the organization that on the one hand has always tried to avoid any confrontation with the regime because, again, security is kind of paramount in their mindset. And so they saw this as simply a cause or an excuse for the regime to crack down on them entirely. And because they're also suspicious of other elements within Egyptian society, so that they don't want necessarily to be part of a broader effort in which they can kind of get swept under the rug by a more popular uprising that doesn't necessarily allow them to seize on their on the victories. And so it's only after the success of the uprising in February 11th or February 18th of 2011 that you ultimately find that those core leaders push to the forefront and now trying to maximize their gains. And of course, there's also a sense that this politics is not a zero-sum game, and that they had made certain successes or certain accomplishments under the Mubarak regime. And as a result of this, they don't want necessarily to sacrifice those, to forego the gains that they made. This kind of tit-for-tat accommodation that's been taking place over a period of decades, that to kind of throw that all away on the basis of an uncertain revolt was something that seemed too risky from this core group of individuals. But nonetheless, as this revolution succeeds, or at least succeeds in toppling Mubarak at the very least, the Muslim Brotherhood immediately announces the political party. But again, you start to see that in addition to announcing his political party, that you do now have a factionalization that's taking place within the core membership, but especially members from this generation. One of whom is Abul Futuh, who very quickly assumes or makes the decision to run as a presidential candidate, with or without the blessing of the Muslim Brotherhood, because he didn't seek their blessing and because he's certainly not closely tied with this core internal leadership. They immediately disavow his decision and they threaten him with basic excommunication should he proceed with his decision. He says, it wasn't my decision to remove myself from the organization, but if that's their wish, then I'm going to proceed with my candidacy anyway. Another core member from this generation, Ibrahim al-Zafarani, who comes out of the Alexandria University, it's medical school, and is the leadership, part of the leadership there, but also again focused on this kind of outreach, reformist vision, also announces that he wants to start his own political party. And again, the key decision that the Muslim Brotherhood makes in founding the Freedom and Justice Party is to basically say everyone who is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood has now to be a member of our political party. And this decision is widely condemned by many members of the organization who say, why can't we be members of a broader social, activist, religious organization and then be able to choose our political affiliation independently? And so this becomes a key moment for division, and it's actually, the individuals we see there, Mohamed Morsi, Khairat al-Shatir, certainly enough, who's kind of the chief strategist as part of this conservative core within the organization, that actually push politics kind of to the forefront all of a sudden after they've been holding back for decades. But now they've seized on this opportunity, and there's a sense that they could actually make considerable gains and actually accomplish many of the goals that the Muslim Brotherhood has had over the long haul. And so you start to see this new exodus of members from this generation. Again, Zafarani, who founds al-Nahda party, a Renaissance party that's based in Alexandria with the core of its strength. Again, it's a small political party. It doesn't quite have the same mobilization mechanisms that's able to kind of carry it forward in the parliamentary elections. But it's a signal of the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood is starting to shed a lot of the people who've been very kind of independent-minded for a very long time, who've been very frustrated by the inability to kind of shape a lot of the internal decisions and mechanisms that are at work within the organization. And we see it also in the presidential candidacy of Abdul Moneim Abul Futuh, who shapes himself as much more, he's always been the kind of liberal, more progressive voice within the Muslim Brotherhood to begin with, and so now, immediately kind of freed from the shackles of the organization, he's able to actually build a very strong coalition with the broad swath of Egyptian society, secularists, liberals, unions, in addition to even some other religious organizations like the Salafi movement, for instance, that couldn't find a candidate to get behind, certainly was resentful of Muslim Brotherhood's monopoly on sort of religious politics, and so they even threw their weight behind his candidacy. And we see that it actually generated a very strong groundswell among the youth. There was a very strong mobilized youth contingent that identified with him. And of course, he engages in the first and very historic presidential debate in the Arab world to ever take place, one that was watched by millions, not just in Egypt, but also around the region and really around the world. And that debate, of course, took place against Omar Musa, who was Mubarak's foreign minister, later becomes the chief of the Arab League, and kind of distanced himself from the legacy of Mubarak and had kind of called for reforms earlier on, and so he kind of built his own campaign. The interesting thing is in the outcome of the first round of the presidential race that both of these candidates ultimately suffered, probably because of the debate, because people weren't used to seeing presidential candidates debating, and so by kind of taking jabs at one another, there was a sort of psychological break between the idea of leadership as being sort of beyond criticism to then the idea that they both kind of weaken each other's chances. So they actually ended 4th and 5th respectively. But there's also something to be said about the fact that Abul Futuh initially was leading in the polls, and the Muslim Brotherhood kind of put its full force behind the idea of defeating him specifically. And so they focused most of their campaign and most of their energies to actually try to defeat a candidate who comes out of their kind of school of thought. One of the interesting comments that Abul Futuh makes throughout the campaign, when he's constantly asked about his Muslim Brotherhood affiliation. Some people think that he's just their secret candidate, and this is all just a strategy that if they don't lose, or if they lose, that they can win through him, and he can kind of surreptitiously take over power in Egypt. But he's constantly, of course, very averse to that notion, and it's quite obvious that the break between him and Khairat al-Shatir specifically, that there's something very deeply personal about the break between them, but that he also resents the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood as a place that's going to kind of dictate the decisions of all its individuals and all of its kind of sons far into the future, that he's part of a new generation now that should be made, it should be given leadership. And so he almost resents it as much as what Mubarak was trying to do by basically disenfranchising this entire generation. And so one of the things that he says is, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is like a school that all of us should go to and kind of graduate from, but eventually you have to graduate from school and, you know, move on in a way. And so this is kind of the lesson that he's taken is in kind of trying to found his own political party for the future. And of course, just finally, to talk a little bit about the victory of Mohamed Morsi, I think this is really a testament to the triumph of the organizational structure, right? So that we could spend a long time kind of, you know, describing the ways in which it's actually weakened the organization, the ways that it's actually held them back for many years. But I think ultimately we find that it was only through having this rigid internal structure that the Muslim Brotherhood is able to kind of decimate all of its opponents in these elections, including the regime, which also mobilized tremendously in favor of Ahmed Shafiq and somehow still came up short. And so somehow, you know, you know, this organization is far stronger, perhaps, than even a lot of people give credit for. It's constantly being underestimated. But I think although in the short term it's made tremendous gains in allowing somebody like Morsi to actually kind of rise all the way to the presidency, it's going to hinder it going forward, because there is going to be kind of, again, increased frustration with the idea of having to remain completely loyal and not being able to kind of express oneself within an organization, especially as Egypt is kind of approaching a transition toward a broader, you know, pluralistic, democratic society in which you are going to have to learn how to, you know, respectfully deal with other opinions, whether in the parliament, whether in civil society, whether in the media, and certainly within the presidency and within the leadership. And so these are kind of the challenges that are going to face the Muslim Brotherhood in the years to come. But although it's something that's kind of allowed it to endure for so long, all of these decades of repression, it might actually ultimately serve as its source of its demise. So I'll leave it there, but I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead. Jose.
Okay, thank you. Could you give us an economic or class profile of the membership of the group, the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yeah, so this has also been something that's subject to a considerable shift over the years. As it reconstitutes in the 1970s, it starts to kind of pull in a lot of the, what you might call the urban migrants, the people who are coming out of the villages and requiring education, and part of this new wave of young urbanized professionals. A new middle class that's actually part of the outgrowth of Sadat's liberalization policies and continues into Mubarak's more extreme kind of liberalization policies in the 1990s. And so there is kind of a shift in the profile of, or the class profile of the Muslim Brotherhood into one that's a little bit more as part of this middle or upper middle class. And this has been part of, again, part of the source of its critique. Now, having said that, of course, they still rely on a base that comes out of a lot of the villages in the countryside within Egypt. There's a certain kind of family loyalty that comes out of perhaps even people who've shifted to the cities that, you know, their family members continue to also identify with the Muslim Brotherhood. And so it does generate considerable support out of those corners as well. And of course it pays lip service to a broader social justice mission in its platform, even if we don't necessarily see that in practice. Yes?
I was just curious, I think it's really interesting to think about this generation, the kind of Morsi, like 70s, I guess, generation of people who were student activists, right? And now they're facing an entire group of people who are, many of them disenchanted, right, with the success of Muslim Brotherhood, who don't feel like they represent the vision of the protests and the student movements in 2011. So I'm just curious, like, I mean, do they speak about that or kind of recognize that irony that they were themselves student activists and what kinds of connections they see with them, with the kind of 2011 student movement?
Well, I mean, they certainly, I try to say that they identify with them, that it's still a common struggle. Of course, now that, you know, the ire of the student protesters is turning against the Muslim Brotherhood's time in office now, there's always a certain idea that, well, you know, they've taken things to an extreme and you know, we're not dictators, so it's one thing when we protested against Nasser and Sadat, but now, you know, they're protesting against a young democracy that hasn't even been given the opportunity to govern, even, you know, for just a few months. Egypt is currently operating even without an elected parliament. There's no constitution. There's a committee right now that's trying to write the constitution that's having a very difficult time deciding. So all of these things remain unsettled, so there's a frustration with the frustration that's coming out of the student movement. The idea that, you know, why are they continuing to take to Tahrir Square? The Muslim Brotherhood has actually sent its own protesters, quite often as counter-protesters, to the other youth movement. There's also a sense that they're just representing the embittered liberals that clearly have no electoral power, and so they just continue to gather and rally and whine in the streets rather than actually organizing themselves. And so that's the kind of way that they've been dismissed so far. The interesting thing about Morsi, though, is that he actually doesn't really come out of that legacy. In fact, this is partly why I think he doesn't represent this reformist, outward-looking approach that the Muslim Brotherhood has. He actually only joins the Muslim Brotherhood once he's in the United States. He comes to USC to do his doctoral work, and it's only there that he starts to kind of become a little bit more identified with the movement, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if it's been mentioned a little bit, I think, but it's not necessarily something that a lot of people have kind of given credence to. Don't tell Michelle Bachmann.
With all the turmoil going on in Egypt right now, I'm a little concerned about the human rights situation. I'm a member of the Baha'i community, and I've heard that the Egyptian Baha'i community has been made statements by the Salafis that Baha'i property can be taken with impunity. So what is going on against religious minorities? I know the Coptics are having problems too, but what is going on in that whole area?
Okay, so the problem, I think, is that we're finally seeing a shift in which Egyptians as citizens are actually helping to shape the concept of citizenship in their country. This is something that's been more or less, been a top-down imposition for a very long time, whether it's through British colonialism and its assessment of what it meant to be Egyptian, whether it's through the post-revolutionary imposition of what Nasser envisioned to be Egyptian as opposed to Sadat, as opposed to Mubarak. And so for the first time, Egyptians are actually trying to have this conversation in an open place that hasn't necessarily been had before. And so part of the difficulty, of course, is the role that religion will play in the popular culture in society and, of course, in politics. And so this is the discussion that's being had now by the committee that's writing the Constitution. I think all parties so far have at least accepted the idea that Egypt is a civil state, that religion is not the basis of identity, even if it can kind of help shape policy or help shape legislation, but it's certainly not embedded within the Constitution. That all Egyptian citizens, that there's a feeling that all Egyptian citizens are equal, and that there's no distinction between them based on religion. There's no, for instance, imposition against a president coming out of the minority religious communities. And that there were some overtures coming on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood toward the communities, but of course it continues to play out publicly. And so a lot of what we're seeing now is more just the rhetoric coming out of these organizations, right? So the Salafis, who don't necessarily have a strong role to play policy-making wise as of yet, but are certainly trying to kind of push a certain agenda that they have, but one that's been largely rejected by the majority of Egyptians. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, has kind of taken a much more pragmatic approach of saying certain things to please some constituencies and other things to please other constituencies. And this is, I think, part of the problem that they've had, is that they haven't taken a very courageous stand on a lot of these issues. But again, this is part of the struggle of, again, transitioning from a place where the citizens of Egypt haven't really had a role to play in this conversation to now finding themselves in this very difficult position of having to say these things. But of course, these are all very important concerns, to be sure.
It's a confused question. Taking into consideration what's going on the economic level, with all these new rules, and the society as a whole have also become generally Islamized within the last 10, 15 years with the impact of the Gulf region. And all these new pro-Muslim Brother sense, ideological sense on the Egypt street. We saw it in the whole confrontation for Sharia last week. And then looking at the leadership as you depicted them, coming out from a school that's very disciplinary, very hierarchical, educated in the prisons, many of them under torture. How much can they go out of this mental frame of the Mubarak regime, because that was also authoritarian, and they themselves having such a situation, how they can deal with these issues? It sounds as though we're onto an era of chaos rather than an era of really the Muslim Brothers taking matters into their hands. I can understand the worries of the minorities, where they are puny, and if the issues of Sharia are so strong, they will be walked over. So I don't know how much you can really envisage that this leadership is going to really formulate itself outside of its legacy. And it is a generation that really has in many ways completely ignored those who have many of the very liberal elements of the population who had started the 2012 events, the youth and everybody else, and the labor.
Yeah, certainly. I think the problem, of course, is that it's a political culture right now that's in its infantile stage. There isn't a strong, firm belief or practice in pluralism, and the idea that you kind of there's a political bargaining process that takes place, in other kind of democratic cultures that hasn't necessarily been there, because again, this is part of a strategic tit for tat approach that the Muslim Brotherhood has constantly taken with regard to its relationship vis-a-vis the Mubarak regime. And now it's a matter of how do we disengage from our normal standard operating procedure of viewing everything again through a security lens, through kind of narrow wins and losses, through tactical approaches, and just kind of sort of let your guard down a little bit and be able to actually engage with other forces in society, especially now that they find themselves in a position in which they are essentially the only political power in Egypt. That there's a feeling among them that they don't necessarily have to bargain. They don't necessarily have to give up a lot of things, and so there is a threat in terms of their, they're not developing a strong political culture and simply continuing politics as usual under Mubarak, except now they kind of represent that. And that's not to say that they're going to turn into a dictatorship or a totalitarian regime. I certainly think those moments are over. But there's a sense that they can at least, the sort of tyranny of the majority kind of situation that could take place in which they're able to amass enough political power, both in terms of representation in parliament, repeated elections to the presidency, appointments to the courts, that will enhance their ability to kind of push a particular agenda. Now what that agenda is remains to be seen. On the economic front, I think it was the initial point of the question, they seem to have adopted a very sort of, neoliberal view, I guess, for lack of a better term, in terms of their, wanting to continue outward focused on bringing in investment into Egypt. They've adopted international loans, something that's actually been the main cause for a lot of the protests recently. People said, we don't like the conditions, and this hasn't been put to a public discussion. No one has actually talked about the fact that these IMF loans could potentially be damaging to Egyptian workers or to or agriculture. And yet, these are kind of decisions that the president now deems that he has the right to kind of make unilaterally. Again, not that different from a lot of states in that regard, but certainly in a place like Egypt where these decisions are still being kind of negotiated before this presidency has had a chance to kind of really grow, flourish, and establish itself. These could be obviously very costly decisions. And I think it comes out of this mindset coming from Khayrat al-Shata and other elements within the organization that, again, have always seen strong-arm politics as being the way to success, and also given his business background, the idea that this is, again, the way to kind of engage with the West broadly in these kind of international institutions. And yeah, there is, I think, certainly a worry that there won't be a proper kind of democratic culture to come out of at least this initial process. But this is part of the struggle that the rest of Egyptian civil society is engaging in, especially through the establishment of their organizations, the protest movement, are trying to kind of push that.
The concern is that the politics of the Muslim Brother is also excluding of anybody within themselves that do not agree.
Right, exactly.
Initially, we heard of breaks within them, of the younger generation.
Right.
They shut up.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives us one has to worry of a pattern of behavior that's going to impact the politics generally is the Supreme Guide going to continue leading even within this middle-age generation? I mean, they're not the younger, and there are younger Muslim brothers who we do not hear anymore of. This is, I know you are, it's impossible, but we are all, living this kind of uncertainty.
With learning the history Muslim Brotherhood and its history. It's become more frustrating with some of the portrayals dealing with U.S. media. I was wondering if it's all right if we comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the frustrating thing is when you, first of all, you recognize that it's an organization that is so deeply flawed and has so many problems and is so deserving of critiques. But what's frustrating is when you see that they're being criticized for all the wrong reasons. That in fact they've become almost pragmatic to a fault, so that it's not a matter of their ideology. Their ideology is almost right now plays second fiddle to their demand for power, regardless of whether they're actually trying to implement certain policies. So this obsession with the idea that they're going to enact Sharia, that they're going to oppress minorities, I mean, all of those things generally are secondary to the idea that they simply should have the ability to kind of enforce things that are beneficial to it in the long term, like some of these economic policies that I think are more dangerous. I mean, the idea that they would somehow impose, let's say, a ban on the sale of alcohol, for instance, in a country that relies so highly on tourism, is obviously not going to happen, because they're thinking more in terms of the economic benefit of tourism for their country, and they're not going to kind of affect that by trying to kind of ban the sale of alcohol. And so examples like that, I think, are helpful, because they show us that, in fact, this is their overriding concern, is that they're trying to kind of right the economy, they're trying to continue to promote tourism, they're trying to continue to promote the strengths at the expense of things that may otherwise seem ideological, but are actually not really much of a consideration anymore, beyond sort of few fringe members who kind of pay lip service to these things every once in a while. You certainly won't see it in their political platform, you won't see it coming out of the mouths of any of the leaders. And so these are kind of some of the things that we continue to hear. Obviously there's this whole idea of the past association with violence that I think is, again, is misunderstood. They tend to be lumped in with the kind of broader militant jihadist specter that we've seen for the last 10 years that's been kind of governing U.S. policy towards the region, and that kind of, again, creeps up constantly, both from among policymakers here, within the media. All of that is kind of misguided, and it's really just a product of domestic political considerations, perhaps more so even than a real desire on actually trying to understand what's going on there. Yeah, was that?
Yeah, just to follow up, to what extent is Egypt facing a challenge of forming a modern national identity? I mean, it certainly has a historical one, but we're looking at an Egypt that was battered by colonialism, had its whole government shaped by colonialism, so that the dictatorships are, in a sense, holding actions to the transition to what is envisioned as modern democracy. So in a way, Egypt is struggling with the importation of Western values into a traditional society, and is that part of the problem?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's certainly a challenge, but I think it's one that over the last 10 or 20 years or so, I think they've certainly tried to overcome. There's a strong belief in state institutions, and that this should be a state built on institutions rather than on personalities, or rather than on principles, or even on religion. Everyone kind of believes in these institutions because they've been around for a very long time, and even if they've been abused, Egyptian citizens at least hold very strongly to the position of the presidency, to the status of the parliament, even if they disagree with the people that were occupying those positions. And this is why we've actually seen, rather than a sort of scrapping of the entire constitution, scrapping of the state, this hasn't been a revolution in a true sense. What we're seeing is a kind of, accelerated reform movement, you could say. You remove the head of state, but you keep all the institutions. This is why this has been such a disjointed transition over the last 2 years, is because on the one hand, they've removed the head of state, but then they're allowing the same people who've been governing to help make the decisions of where we go from here. So the courts are all the same. The judges have been ruling on who's eligible to run for the presidency, who's eligible to run for parliament, the same courts that actually dissolved the parliament that was elected. All of these things are being done by elements of the previous regime, which is unthinkable from the perspective of people who actually believe that this is a real revolution. And so again, Egyptians really believe in the institutions of their state. I don't think there's really a conflict with their having a modern sort of national identity. I think that kind of question has sort of been settled over decades, whether it's forcibly or willingly. It's just, it's just the fact of it's kind of the fact.
I'm just curious as to the situation on the ground. I mean, with all the protests that are still happening, I mean, do we see any other parties forming, or any other revolutionary groups forming that might oppose Morsi? And just because it's so shaky right now, you can kind of...
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly other political figures we didn't really discuss. Baradei, for instance, who notable, of course, in the international community. He built his credibility on the fact that he was one of the earliest people to call for Mubarak's downfall, far before it was the thing to do, and it was not something that would get you into trouble. Of course, he used his international status and his kind of name recognition to kind of avoid any real clampdown on him over the years. And so this kind of helped him. And now he's founded a party, I think it's called the Distur, the Constitutional Party, that's basically, their purpose is to offer a kind of secular liberal alternative to what the Muslim Brotherhood is offering. He's kind of been able to gather other important personalities around him. You know, they're putting together a certain agenda. Some people see them as kind of trying to detract too much from the gains of the revolution. So there's kind of all sorts of questions about what their actual long-term capabilities and objectives are going to be. But beyond that, you still have the same kind of core youth movements that continue to say, you know, we reject this political process out of hand. We don't think that this transition has been anything short of just handing over power within, again, these flawed institutions that need to be reformed at the core far greater. And so they continue to occupy Tahrir Square, they continue to work within their local communities, they continue to work with a lot of the labor unions in Egypt, and try to kind of, again, work outside of this political system. So we have seen movements to kind of boycott all of these elections, all of these referendum, boycott the constitutional writing process, by forces within society, but especially among the youth, that don't really believe in this process. And they were some of the first to actually come out to Tahrir Square, and so they continue to kind of hold on to a very idealized vision of what their objectives were early on in that process. Yeah.
I was just curious, it's a pretty strong party. How are they funded? And what's their source of, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, like I said, it went through this transition in which it started to develop a very strong base coming out of this middle to upper middle class. You know, Khairat al-Shatir, for instance, not only made millions for himself personally, but he actually handles the finances of the organization. So he's invested quite successfully in a way that generates tremendous funds to fund the group's activities. And also there's individual membership fees, which start to pile up when you're talking about over 1 million members throughout the country. And so these are kind of some of the ways that they've been able to kind of finance their activities.
No, as far as when, you know how you said they held elections and had the positions in the parliament. So was it purely from the party, or was the candidate as well?
Well, the candidates, I mean, it's from the party. The political party generally puts in all the financing for the mobilization efforts. And it happens on the grassroots level as well, on the local level.
What about support from the Gulf?
Yeah, I mean, again, this has always been one of those things that it's thrown out there a lot. You don't necessarily see specific facts of it, but certainly there was a sense that the Egyptian elections were being very closely watched and invested in by interested parties abroad. This involved everyone from the United States to, you know, Iran to a small extent, to the Gulf states who did get behind, especially Qatar probably got behind the Muslim Brotherhood far more. The Saudis were probably a little bit more in favor of the Salafis, so they seem to put a little bit more of the support.
Some of the Saudis
and some of the Saudis are also.
And then it backlashed because they're worried about their own.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah. So that's also another source of support, is that there is external funding. I mean, the laughable thing, of course, is that Egypt technically has limits on spending and campaigns, and you know every campaign exceeded it 100 times over. It was never even a question that people would actually hold on to what the law says in terms of how much you can spend on your election. Very good.